So today's topic is all about pruning, and this topic is a little bit of a departure from often what we're talking about around regenerative growing. Certainly, there's overlap, and I'm going to be speaking to some of that. But we felt like today would be a really good opportunity to give you some hands-on techniques, and I know that people are eager to also get information for their indoor house plants and their ornamental plants. So that was another aim for this topic this week. So as usual, we will give folks an opportunity to say hello. For those of you who did your homework from last week, you'll recall that you were to look into, try and dig out whether you could find where you had planted particular crops last year so that you could incorporate that into your garden map or your growing space plan for this season. And then you are also asked to identify which primary crops, which were those crops you wanted to grow that you felt like you were going to eat lots of, and if any of those were heavy feeders. So if you did get your homework done, I would love to hear all about that. And then if not, we have another intro question. We'll then dive into our topic around pruning, not seed starting. That was a few weeks ago now. And as always, we've got this week especially, we've got a really great promo deal, and then the opportunity to ask questions. So this is your chance. I like to turn it over. I've really enjoyed getting to hear from you folks and getting to know the different types of participants that we have here, what your interests are. So today, for anybody that wanted to say hello and spend 30 seconds introducing themselves, you could speak to the homework, or you could certainly also speak to your interest and or experience with pruning. Now, if you would like to say hello, you're going to, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a smiley face, an emoji. If you click that, there'll be a hand logo icon, and you click that, and that is how you put your hand up. And then I see that, and then I know that you would like to say hello. So I'm going to ask Kat if you see anyone, because again, I'm struggling with my viewer. Would anybody like to say hello? Now's your chance. If not, we'll just we'll get straight into things.
Don't see anyone yet.
No worries. Okay. Well, in that case, we'll carry on. Everyone's excited then to learn about pruning. So I always start with a recap. I know most of you will be well versed in this by now, because certainly this idea that soil health revolves around healthy microbial populations and a diverse spectrum of microbial populations in the soil is really pivotal to this idea of regenerative growing. So again, for those of you who are more recent joining us, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, regenerative growing, we're talking about this idea that when we grow plants, whether they're food or ornamental, indoors or outdoors, we can in fact do it in such a way as to improve the soil, improve that ecosystem season after season, year after year. And this, of course, is in contrast to conventional or chemical agriculture, where in fact we're degrading the soil and degrading the ecosystem year after year. And it all comes down to how we treat our friends, our microbial friends that are in the soil. And when we are treating them with TLC and respect, then certainly they are able to do the jobs that Mother Nature gave them, that they're intended to be doing, which in turn allows for a synergistic relationship. So plants are able to communicate with the microorganisms that exist in soil. They have a special language made of carbon sugars, and they excrete this sugar, this language, through their roots. And as long as the right types of microorganisms are ready and waiting in the soil, then they will respond to whatever the plant has asked for. So I always liken this to a pizza order delivery service where the plant is able to request a specific type of pizza. However, microorganisms are very niche. They have very specific roles, and often they remain dormant until they have been asked by the plant to fulfill that specific role. And as long as they are dormant and not dead or not totally absent, then they will actually wake up and respond. They will go out much further than the root systems could ever reach themselves. They'll find the nutrient or produce the nutrient that has been requested, and then they'll bring it back to the root system. They'll hand it over to the plant, who in exchange then provides a tip, like a thank you to that microbe with another glucose sugar. The microbial population is able to grow and get stronger, they multiply, and at the same time, because the plant now has the nutrients it needs, it has this on-demand delivery service, it is also able to grow bigger and stronger and healthier. And together it becomes a positive feedback cycle. And that's really what we're talking about when we say an ecosystem, is this idea that the biology, the organisms in the soil, and certainly in the air as well. We can't forget that these microorganisms are everywhere, and we can't see them. So we don't think they are there. We forget, but they're in fact bacteria and fungi and all of these players are in fact floating around, and they coat our plants. And when those are working together, the ecosystem is getting stronger and stronger. And this is going to be important again when we get into the specifics of pruning and why pruning is also related to the health of your soil and certainly the health of your plant. So when we talk about pruning, we're specifically looking at this idea of removing dead, overgrown, unsightly branches, stems, leaves, and really trying to replicate Mother Nature to some extent. So, of course, in nature, in natural, untouched ecosystems, there's no one out there with their pruning clippers taking care of removing dead leaves and dead foliage. Of course, the difference there is, and there's a few differences, but one of the biggest ones is that compared to houseplants, especially, the environmental factors that are at play in a natural ecosystem really take care of a lot of this work. So things like wind and rain will in fact do this pruning when there is a dead or a loose leaf that is just hanging on by a thread. Then that's going to get blown off, or the rain, a heavy rainstorm will pull it off the plant. And then of course there's also the action of animals who will then sometimes selectively remove dead foliage or assist with this generally natural mechanism that Mother Nature would have in place. We of course have to replicate that a little bit ourselves indoors and even outdoors as well in our urban or suburban growing spaces, because we just don't have that same level of environmental factor. We're often quite removed, and then we don't have the animals as well doing their job. So this is important. And I would also offer that in nature, there's a better, or let's say, it comes down to survival of the fittest. And when we're growing our own gardens, don't necessarily want to leave things to chance quite so much. We put a lot of work. Often we bought expensive plants or shrubs, and we really want to be maximizing the yield of our efforts. And that in order to do that, we do need to give a little bit of extra care. Unlike in nature, where if an apple tree, for example, has two branches rubbing, which results in one of those branches ultimately being unable to produce much yield, it's not the end of the world. So, what are the benefits of pruning? Well, certainly, one of the biggest benefits is it actually stimulates growth in other parts of the plant or other areas of the plant, and we're going to get into why that is in just a second. But this is important for a few reasons. So, sometimes we do have plants that are growing up when in fact we want them growing out. And so pruning is one way that we can in fact encourage horizontal growth rather than vertical growth. And for those of you who were here a few weeks ago, we talked about this idea of in our limited growing spaces, we do want to be maximizing 3D space. So depth and height and width as well. So pruning is one of the tools we have when we have a plant that is essentially growing in a different direction than that which we would like it to be growing. And we can guide it towards more growth. As well, sometimes plants will focus their growth on one particular stem. And we, in fact, want it to be a more fulsome growth or more coverage with the leaves. And so, again, we're looking at pruning as an option to redirect some of that energy. Pruning also increases flower growth. And this is really important for those of you who are flower lovers, and ornamental growers. But it's also really critical to appreciate that flowers are the mechanism by which plants reproduce. So if we are interested in growing the amount of plants that we have, if we have a few and we're really hoping that that plant is going to take over a particular space, then we want to encourage flowering. And as well, this is particularly important for my fruit and veg growers, that flowers are ultimately what produces our fruit and or our vegetable. And so when we encourage increased flowering, we are ultimately going to be improving our yield. We're increasing the number of fruits that we are going to be able to grow on that plant, and ultimately get more bang for our buck in terms of our efforts. Pruning is also critical to preventing the spread of pest and disease. And often, no, not always, but often it is related to airflow. And one thing that applies almost across the board is this idea that the more cramped that plants are, the more overlap that their stems or leaves have, the greater likelihood there is of disease, infection, or pest being spread. And this, of course, is a bit of a challenge to manage because as urban or suburban growers, as high density growers, we do like to plant close together. We're maximizing that 3D space. But at the same time, we don't want plants rubbing up against each other directly, and we also don't want them to be able to transfer disease. So especially with tomatoes, for example, adequate airflow is really critical to preventing pathogens and, for example, moldy spores from being able to really take hold. And so pruning is where we're able to help with that. Pruning for certain plants can also provide us with cuttings. So cuttings is the name of when we are able to cut a plant in a very particular place, and that cutting, that piece that we have removed, will in fact, under the right circumstances, regrow into a new plant. So in that case, what we're doing is we're actually carbon copying that plant. We're taking that DNA of that plant, which is in the cutting, and we're rooting it either in water or sometimes rooting solution, although rooting solution isn't very safe. So generally don't advocate for that. And then from there, the cutting will grow into a replicate of the initial plant. We are not going to talk too much about propagation today because it is a whole topic really onto itself. And we are going to, I believe it is slated in for later this season, and Kat can maybe double check on that for me, what day that would be. And if not, then we'll definitely look at adding that to the roster. Last, but probably one of the most important things is that pruning is a great first aid tool. If you have a plant, indoors or outdoors, that is on the verge of demise, then pruning often can be the last hope you have at trying to resuscitate that plant. And sometimes you're pruning selectively and removing the dead or dying leaves and only leaving the ones that are still alive. However, often at that point, all the foliage is brown or well on its way to being brown. And you can, in fact, completely prune it. Most plants you may be able to prune entirely, really only leaving the roots in the ground. And what that does, again, not always, but often, is that it sort of resets the plant and it forces it to put the energy it does have into its root system. And that's critical for plant rehab, because by putting its energy into its root system, it's going to be able to feed that microbial population, assuming it's ready and waiting, and really get the nutrients it needs by working with those microorganisms to then establish a stronger root system, was what it will do first, to then be able to work with more microbes, get that positive feedback cycle going, and then eventually regrow or a new stem and then into new leaves. And I can tell you for sure that this works. Last fall I picked up a bunch of basically frozen dead houseplants off the side of the road. And all winter we've been nursing them back to health, and a lot of them were just totally had to be completely cut off, and now they're finally, with the more light and a few helpings of worm manure, are coming back and growing new foliage, which is pretty exciting when that happens. So let's talk a little bit about the science, and this is always where I like to dive deeper. And so the first thing to appreciate is, like so many other things, plants are just like you and I, in that they have hormones that regulate their growth. And there's a variety of hormones that do this. Another name that you sometimes will hear is plant growth stimulators, or plant growth factors, PGF. These are all sort of the same term for this idea that a plant actually produces molecules that either encourage growth or in fact hinder growth. And the two that we're looking at here are auxins and cytokines. So the auxin is located, is a group of cells that are specifically created to produce this hormone auxin. And they are in fact at the tip end of a branch or basically the tip of any branch on a plant. And when the auxin serves the purpose of stopping further growth of that tip or of that branch. And it's critical that it's there, because if it wasn't, what would happen is that branch would just keep growing and growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. And the plant would have to put all of its energy and resources into maintaining that growth. And in fact, it would really never get around to having the opportunity to grow flowers, which ultimately allows it to reproduce and ensure that it's going to continue to live, or that its population is going to continue to exist. And so auxins play a very vital role. And when we're pruning, what we want to do is remove those selective cells at the end of the tip, so that cytokines, which is the contrary hormone, or the hormone that works in an opposite way, can in fact come back and do what it does. And so a cytokine is a hormone that encourages the plant to continue replicating cells, to allow it, those plant cells, to allow it to continue to grow. And so what's really important here is that when a seedling is young, it has a lot of these cells producing cytokines to allow the plant to very quickly grow and branch out. And then as it moves through the stages from vegetation to flowering, the auxin cells come into effect and allow that energy to be redirected to the flowering stage. So what we're doing when we're pruning is effectively removing the auxin cells so that the cytokines can be produced, they can grow that branch, and after a number of weeks, it's a bit dependent on the type of plant, but after some time, the auxin cells will come back. So it's not a forever type thing. This is a natural mechanism the plant has to ensure that energy and resources are always going in the right direction. So it is the type of thing where eventually we have to come back and prune repeatedly. So if we start and take a little quick look at the pruning of flowers, there's a couple of different pieces here. And the big one is that when we prune flowers, especially flowers that are past their prime, we in fact are encouraging new blooms. And it does come back to this idea that the plant reproduces through the flower. And as soon as that flower is removed, the plant receives the signal that it effectively has no reproductive mechanism in place. And it then is going to redirect its effort and its energy and its resources towards producing more flowers. And again, this is Mother Nature at her best, where job number one is ultimately reproduction, to survive, to pass on those genes to the next generation. So when we quickly remove flowers, which is also known as deadheading, from a plant, we are in fact ultimately going to benefit from having more blooms overall. Now, I would suggest with any type of plant, as soon as that flower begins to wilt or shows some discoloration, that you can, often I just pop it off with my fingernail. You can kind of just right under the flower head where it meets the stem, you can sort of just almost just cut it off with your fingernail and pop that flower off, and another stem will grow to replace it. Certainly, you do want to ideally be doing this during your spring, summer, when there is more sunlight, and that's because it's going to allow the plant to reproduce more quickly and redirect those energy towards having more blooms. When it comes to pruning leaves, we get a little bit more technical. And often this is also where perhaps we're doing a little bit of first aid. So the most obvious would be that any leaves that are yellow or browning or discolored should be removed fairly quickly. And that's because the plant will continue to put resources, continue to feed that leaf, even though it is deteriorating. And what that means is those resources are not going somewhere else where they could be better used. And so when we're removing the discolored foliage, we're in fact speeding up this process by which the plant is going to be able to better direct where it's putting its energy. Additionally, we often prune leaves when we start to see evidence of pests or pathogens. So, this topic is a really big one that we'll want to probably address in a session on its own. But certainly, as soon as you notice any kind of indication of a bad microbe, so usually in the top here, well, that's actually something different, but we're seeing mold or some kind of deterioration of the plant, discoloration, likely indicates that there's been some kind of infection. As well, there's always the fact that plants can get infested with pests. And the photo you have here at the top, that's scale. It looks like a pathogen, like a mold, but those are in fact very tiny little white pests, little insects that will come to live on your plant. And it does look like dust initially and or mold. So do not be fooled. If you are noticing like a coating of dust or mold on your plant, take a very close inspection, and you may be unfortunately dealing with a scale issue. And so then we're being a little bit more aggressive with our pruning. We do always want to prune just above an outward facing set of leaves. So when we have our leaves coming out like this, we do want to prune right above those, not right below them. And that's because the plant wants to redirect energy into those leaves. It needs to keep those leaves to be able to perform the photosynthesis that's going to allow it to work with the microbes. And so we have to be a little bit careful about where on the stem that we're making that cut. For herbs, especially basil in particular, they love to have to be pruned. And in fact, it's often said about basil and many herbs, in fact, that you're going to get a lot more yield with constant pruning. Even if you're not using it, you're well advised to snap off the tops of the stems and allow that plant to grow more foliage outwards. So when it comes to pruning branches, in particular, we're looking for plants that have become leggy. So this idea of they've grown really thin and tall, and perhaps they don't have any outward branches. Perhaps they have very few leaves out horizontally. And so for whatever reason, perhaps we just don't like the shape of that plant. We want it to be a fuller plant. Perhaps it's getting too tall for its space, or now it's growing beyond its light source. We want to cut back that branch and allow the plant to grow more fully. And this is especially true with a lot of indoor plants, in part because they are reaching towards light, and often it's a very specific direction or light source, whereas outdoors the light is more dispersed, and so the plant is not necessarily putting its energy into only growing in one direction. So I know I have a ficus plant downstairs that I'm overdue to prune its branches because it's gotten a little bit unmanageable. But in fact, it was too big to bring up here and show you how I'm going to do that. So I have some smaller ones that we're going to use instead. And again, it's really important. I'll show you this in a moment, but you do want to be cutting your branches at a 45-degree angle. And this is critical because it will help reduce the likelihood of a pathogen entering. So it's important to appreciate that when we, especially with branches, when we're pruning branches, we are essentially inflicting a wound on the plant. And that we want to do it in such a way that it repairs or recovers from that wound as quickly as possible. And as well, so that it doesn't allow for pathogens to enter, because that is the biggest concern when we're pruning branches. Often what will happen, and this is a defense mechanism put in place by Mother Nature, is that we'll prune a branch, and very quickly what we would call sap is going to come out of that branch. And you'd be well advised to in fact not touch the sap, allow it to do what it's doing. And it's in fact a first aid technique that the plant has. That sap is coming out to cover that wound and protect it and essentially seal it up, so that any bad microorganisms that are floating around in the air aren't going to be able to use that as a point of entry to get into their plant. So it is important to allow the plant to produce that sap. Don't try and clean it off or anything. It is supposed to be there, and it's a protective mechanism they have. In terms of pruning outdoor plants, and there's a ton of information we could get into here, so we're not going to spend a lot of time. Most fruit trees, in fact, get pruned in the winter before the last frost. So your guess is as good as mine as to when the last frost is going to be this year. My heart goes out to anybody with orchards, because I'm not sure when you're going to prune your trees. And this is often done for a variety of reasons. Of course, any yellowing branches. However, with apple trees, or with fruit trees in particular, they need a lot of airflow. So they're removing any branches that are too close together, removing branches that are touching or rubbing, because that, again, it can, in a big windstorm, could open up a hole in the branch, which would again then allow any bad pathogens to enter. And as well with fruit trees, sometimes they're growing them in a very particular direction or orientation. So that is what they're going to be trying to achieve there. And with the difference between annual and perennial plants, annuals, you certainly want to be pruning regularly, whereas with a perennial plant, like with your shrubs, you're really only looking at once a year. And that is because pruning is stressful. Because we're essentially inflicting a wound on the plant, we are redirecting where the energy is going to go. First, of course, that energy has to go to healing the wound, and then the resources are going to go to growing the parts of the plant that have remained intact. It's a stressful activity for the plant to undergo, and therefore with a perennial specifically, we only want to be doing that once a year, and not as often as an annual, where that overall lifespan is already only one season long. Okay, so now we have our live demo. And again, this is my first time doing a live demo on a webinar, so feedback is welcome if you can't see what I'm doing. So first thing is that it is critical to always sanitize your snippers or your scissors or your shears, whatever you're using. I just use a regular pair of kitchen scissors, because I find they're a lot easier in most cases, unless you're really going through some big branches, in which case you need proper shears, and they should be sharpened. But regardless of what you're using, you do want to sterilize it. And that's because it's very easy to, for example, take one pathogen from a plant and transfer it to another when you're doing that pruning. And again, because we're opening that wound, it can get in very quickly. And as well, if your pruners have been sitting all winter, perhaps they were a bit damp when you put them away, or some fungus has gone into it, it is very possible that they have some bad microorganisms just hanging out there. So I have a lighter, which I'm going to use. although there's lots of different ways that you can sterilize your snippers. So for me, I'm just going to run the lighter back and forth a few times over the blade. And essentially we are using that high heat to get rid of any potential bad guys that are living on my kitchen scissors. Hopefully not too many on my kitchen scissors. So then we have this fern. Actually, this was one of those plants we pulled from the side of the road, and it's done fairly well. You can see in the container here that we did have to do a lot of trimming when we initially picked it up last fall. So for this guy, I'm going to do two types of trimming. So for a leaf like this one, where it is still about 2/3 or 3/4 green, I'm only going to take off the little brown bit at the top. So I'm just going to cut it like that. And it is useful to angle it again on that 45 degrees. That's what's going to most quickly heal that wound. And it also replicates what the end of a normal leaf would look like. So here we have another one, and I'm cutting about 45 degrees to remove the brown bit. Now, on the other side of this plant, we also have a very, very dead leaf. So this one obviously missed its pruning schedule some time ago, and it is in fact completely brown. So we don't want to leave any of this, as is this one actually. We don't want to leave any of this really to steal nutrients from the healthier parts of the plant. So for these guys, I'm actually going to cut them as close to the stem. I don't know if you can see this. Let me see. So I'm cutting it as close to the stem as I can get. And again, on the 45 degrees, and removing as much of that stem as I can. Same there. And of course, what we always want to do when we have pruned our plants is help it recover as quickly as possible. So it has its own first aid mechanisms. And the other thing that we can do to help improve it is to add some worm manure. And there's a few reasons why that is. The most important one is that in addition to all that wonderful microbial life that I've talked about, and which is going to provide those on-demand nutrients, which is really critical because, for example, if that plant needs more sap to heal that wound, it very well likely needs a specific set of nutrients. And within about 3 seconds, it's able to convey that to the microorganisms in the soil, ask for whatever it needs. And as long as the right type of microbe is ready and waiting, it's going to deliver on that first aid kit that the plant is asking for. The other reason, which we haven't really had a chance to talk about much in the sessions yet, is that over and above the microbial goodness in the worm manure, there are additionally plant growth hormones that were in the worm's stomach or intestine, which again are coated on the worm manure. So this is a secondary mechanism of action by which worm manure is such a wonderful natural fertilizer. And again, it goes back to this idea that worms were custom built by Mother Nature for this job of encouraging new growth in plants by recycling these nutrients. So there are additionally natural plant growth hormones in the worm manure that when you add to the soil, the plant actually reads as if it was its own. It's as if the plant had made it themselves and the plant is then being given the indication that it needs to grow bigger, grow faster, put out more blooms. And this is really going to, again, help it recover as quickly as possible from the pruning. Now I have one more demo. Now this plant's a bit bigger. So, okay. This plant is a little too big, maybe. This is a fiddle leaf fig shrub. So it's not the fiddle leaf fig tree that is very popular. You may also know these plants as finicky fiddle leaf figs because they can be very temperamental in terms of the conditions that keep them happy. And so I can tell you, when you're looking at this plant, there's no shame here. You know, no one needs to be embarrassed about sparse foliage. So what's happened is, you know, this plant used to have leaves all up its stem, and at some point it was in the wrong conditions. It wasn't getting enough light primarily, and those leaves went brown. And it's very tempting, I'll tell you, because I've done it myself. It's very tempting to want to leave those brown leaves on in hopes that maybe they're going to come back, or, you know, maybe they're not as brown as you think they are, or that unfortunately doesn't work that way. It is it's one of those scenarios that once the leaf goes brown, it's really only hurting the plant in terms of stealing nutrients. So you have to bite the bullet and say goodbye, and then appreciate that the more leaves are going to be put out at the top. So we see that here, where there's lots of dense foliage coming out at the top. Now, with this type of a plant, so let's see if I can find one of those sort of brown leaves that I've been talking about. I know there's one right at the top, but didn't quite think about how I'm going to do this. So, see if you guys can see this. So this leaf, I don't know if you guys can see how it's brown there? I can't even see if people are shaking their heads. So this leaf was not getting enough light. I think it was sort of in the middle of a window pane. So, you know, this particular one was getting, the sun was getting blocked. And so there's no sense leaving that leaf, because it's really just not helping. So with this plant, I actually happen to know that I can very easily just bend the leaf backwards and it's going to snap off. And kind of like I said with the dead heading, that put that down. So maybe you can see now better how it's really got lots of brown spots on it. If it's possible, and if you know your plant well enough, just sort of bending and snapping them off, the leaf will come away at the natural location. And again, think about in Mother Nature, untouched natural systems, that's what would happen naturally, is the leaf would come off in the ideal location based on environmental factors. So when you can do it, that's my preferred choice. Of course, if the stem is thicker, you may not be able to do that. Okay, so very quickly, and then we'll get to some questions, is that you don't want to prune any plants that, for example, don't form secondary branches. And a good one to talk about for that is tomatoes, because there are two types of tomatoes. You have your determinants and then you have your indeterminants. And the difference there is that indeterminate tomato will continue to grow, to branch out and grow vines through the whole season. So you pruning it, and you can be pretty aggressive with your pruning. You can get it to you know, commercial growers will in fact prune it so it's only got one stem, and they'll tether the stem, trellis it up to the top of the greenhouse. You don't want to do that with discriminant tomatoes. So discriminant tomatoes don't continue to produce vines. They have sort of a set number of vines and branches that they'll create, and then that's it. So if you were to prune those, your tomato is basically going to die. And that is a mistake we've all made. So, make sure when you're buying your tomatoes, if it's discriminate or indiscriminate. Be careful. You don't want to remove too much of the plant's growth. Of course, with the exception being in a first aid scenario where there really is no healthy growth remaining. And in that case, of course, the hope is that in the soil, the root growth is still healthy, and that's the 1/3 of the plant that you're leaving to then regenerate. Do your best not to damage any of the other parts of the plant. Again, we're already inflicting stress by creating a wound, so we want to minimize that stress as much as possible. And then I mentioned, of course, the importance of sterilizing your tools. So for those of you following along at home, your homework this week is to take a look at the plants that you have and which are needing of a little bit of a haircut, and perhaps is there anywhere the direction of growth or the shape of the plant is no longer to its benefit or to your benefit, and that taking some time to prune it and removing those dead leaves will in fact over the long term allow it to grow into a much more beautiful space and 3D dimension. And last but not least, we have our promo deal for all the folks here today. And we've got, we're just about to get into the big season here. So we wanted to give you a really good one. And it fits really well with this idea of pruning. So we're offering $20 off our worm manure 4 kg bag, which is about, no, that's not that one. I don't have it because I forgot it downstairs. And but this bag is about 5 times, more than 5 times our individual size bag. It feeds up to 125 plants. So certainly if you have only a few house plants, you're going to be well set. However, for those that are doing a lot of growing, seed starting, transplanting, potting up, all of those things are going to be better, faster, bigger yields, and ultimately, reducing the stress that you're incurring on your plant because it has the microbial partners it needs. And as I mentioned, it also has these natural plant growth stimulators, plant growth hormones that help the plant get back to its best self as soon as possible. So it is really a great option for this time of year. And this bag does have a shelf life of up to a year. So if you're not going to use it all right away, you don't have to worry. You'll want to use the code PRUNE to get that $20 off, and it is only valid until 11:59 tonight. So with that, we will wrap up. I know there's definitely folks that have to get off their lunch break, but we will also take some questions, and I will turn it over to Kat to line those up for us.
Thanks. So I have been monitoring the chat throughout and answering most of the questions. So if anyone feels like their question hasn't been fully answered or you have any other questions.
Kat, do you have what's been one of the interesting questions that you
Yeah, sure.
that was there?
So how does one prune and shape an indoor snake plant? So it was similar to how you trimmed the bottom of the leaves of the palm of a really sharp knife as close as you can to the soil.
And who asked that question?
Jessie the gardener.
Jessie the gardener. Well, I think Jessie the gardener wins our giveaway bag today for a wonderful question about their snake plants. So thank you, Jessie the gardener. I love the handle. And if you could please send your address, you can direct message it to Kat or you can email either one of us, and we will send you your giveaway bag, which we try to do every week unless I forget. I think I forgot last week, but we do appreciate that you guys are joining us here, and we also want to give folks an opportunity to try out the product. We know that within 2 weeks you're going to see greener growth, fresh leaves. If it's a flowering plant, it's going to start flowering, and now you guys understand why that is the case, because of all the goodness that's in the bag. And there's no better way than to see that for yourself. And of course, tell your friends, because word of mouth is certainly something that we really benefit from as a small business, and as a product that is one that people aren't always familiar with. Oh, Kathleen's got her real hand up, so I'll take that. Yep, Kathleen.
Well, I just quickly, I'm so sorry. I didn't actually catch, I was curious about the snake plant as well, and I didn't hear the response for pruning indoor
yeah,
snake.
so Kat said that it is similar to how we do the like a fern or a like a palm, whereby you are wanting to, well, there's two options. The first is that if there is only a small piece of browned leaf, then you would cut at a 45-degree angle and just remove that.
Right.
If most of the leaf is degraded, then you want to trim it as close to the soil as possible.
Okay, thank you.
The nice thing with the snake plant, of course, which is such a popular houseplant because they're really easy, don't need too much light, don't need too much water, is that they do put up a lot of new leaves, and they do reproduce really quite quickly. So it is the type of plant where you don't need to hem and haw about, oh man, should I, is this, am I ever going to get this leaf back if I get rid of it? But in fact, it is actually going to improve the speed at which it grows back.
Thank you.
Welcome. All right, who else do we have here? Oh, Romana, how's it going? Don't forget to unmute, and then you can ask your question. Yep.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So a lot of great information as usual. Thank you. So I'm interested in trying to propagate. Sorry, I've got siblings and people in the background. So hopefully the noise won't go through. But I wanted to prune roses, lilacs, and hydrangeas, and potentially I'd like to try to propagate from those trimmings as well. So I'm just wondering if you have any tips specifically for the roses, lilacs, and hydrangeas. And I'm just going to put myself back on mute. Thank you.
Sure. So, I mean, I'll start. I'll preface by saying that ornamental shrubs are not my first area of expertise. I'm almost tempted to call on my mom, who is watching this diligently, because she probably could answer it better than I could. But in fact, I'll have Kat maybe quickly try and find. So I do know, I'm quite certain. So the first thing to appreciate is that not all plants, in fact, a lot of plants can't be propagated, that they simply aren't built to reproduce in that way. And as far to the best of my knowledge, although if someone knows better, please correct me if I'm wrong, to the best of my knowledge, and Mom, of course, you're first to do that, is that roses can't be propagated that way, that you can't snip off the stem. I believe that lilacs might be able to, and hydrangeas, I'm not actually sure. So the first thing when propagating is to always find out online, of course, whether the plant you want to propagate is even suitable for doing so. And I don't know the exact science, although it'd be interesting. I'll look into it. I do believe it has to do with these, with the cytokines and the auxins, with the hormones, and whether if a plant continues to make cytokines, which is the one that allows it to the tip to grow, then it is going to be better for propagating, because it will want, those cytokines will do what it does, and it will allow that plant to grow. Some plants don't continuously make new cytokines, in which case I think they're not as suitable to propagate. But Kat, did anything come up quickly in your search?
Yeah, it says that usually hydrangeas, you don't really want to prune, and lilacs just in the spring, just once a year. And
Okay,
then, yeah,
and we're not sure about the propagating on those.
no.
I have a bad feeling that most of those aren't suitable for propagating. We can definitely find out. But I have a feeling that they're not. And the other thing that tells me that is that these are relatively expensive plants to purchase. And that's always another indicator is the plants that are inexpensive are often the ones that are easily propagated because people are snipping them, throwing them in some water, and 2 weeks later they can plant them, and they're basically printing money that way with their plants. Versus, you know, a lot of these are not quite as willing, let's say. So unfortunately, I don't think I have good news for you on that front. But we can, I'll make a note and we'll look into it further. And I know we have your email, Romana, I think from when you won the giveaway. So if we find out different, we'll follow up with you. Cool. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Okay, Suzanne, there you are. You made it with the E on the end. Okay, so you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I just wanted to, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Oh, okay, okay. I just wanted to say about lilacs, prune after they've bloomed, and that way you don't, I mean, if you do it too early, you don't get those blooms for that year because the buds have started forming last year. So as far as when to prune, it's after they flower. That's all I wanted to add.
That's great. Thank you for mentioning that. And I know, you know, lilacs are relatively early bloom. I think they're one of the first to arrive in the spring. So I would wonder if you'd be better off to wait until the fall, whether if the heat would influence the success of the pruning. That would be one concern. But again, I want to do a little bit more research on that and get some more info. But thank you for mentioning that. And I don't know, right now I'm kind of wafting some beautiful lilacs. I know we had that in my backyard when we grew up, so I can picture that right now. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there. We're at 1 o'clock. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It's really a fun treat for me to see all the familiar faces and get these great questions. Don't forget, if you do want to save the $20, use the code PRUNE when you're placing your order at soilbooster.ca. And otherwise, if you have questions, always feel free to email me. And then we'll look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at noon. Have a great week.